Hey friends, I'm Brian Doak and this is George Fox Talks Theology. This season on the Theology channel, we are going to do a new thing. Instead of being here in the studio, which we are for most of our episodes, as you know, we're going to bring you live theology events from the campus of George Fox University. Some of these might be planned lectures in the evenings, and some of these might be a classroom environment where we're teaching our students about Scripture. But whatever the case, you got to imagine yourself in a live setting with an audience there. And if you're watching these, of course, on YouTube, you can see it. And if you're listening, you can think about it and place yourself right there in the seat of that audience. Really excited for these because they're all so good. We hope you enjoy.
Thanks so much, Joel, for inviting me here. And I don't know if I'll live up to that billing, but we'll see.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to start actually when you started in college, back going to Harvard. You were pursuing the sciences, pursuing physics and chemistry, and then you switched to theology and philosophy. So how have each of these spheres, like science and theology, how have they both played a role in your own just vocational journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think even before I went to college, when I was in high school, I think that's when it really started. Like, I grew up in a Christian family, but I grew up in a Christian family that, in a church that we really never talked about these issues with the Bible and science. How do we reconcile the beginnings of Genesis with what we know in our modern day? And it was just kind of assumed, even when we were studying the book of Genesis, it was just kind of assumed that, these days in Genesis 1 are 24-hour periods, and so the earth is really only about 6,000 years old. This is sometimes called young earth creationism. And that's all I knew. I didn't know any other Christians who believed anything else. And so when I went to high school, in my public school, and I took biology class, there are lots of arguments there, lots of debates there. And I remember when I had this distinct recollection because I love science too, right? So I grew up, really reading on my own a lot about different areas of science. And I was just like, wait a minute, I don't see how these things kind of fit together, right? And I felt so underinformed about these questions. I think it's that freshman year in biology class that really kind of began this journey that's now taken decades, actually, of trying to get a better understanding of both Scripture, theology, as well as the scientific questions and the scientific evidence that we deal with. And so like in my undergraduate class, I was reading a lot in addition to taking my science classes. But I remember this one moment that I thought really started bringing them really close together. And it was in a biological chemistry class, and we had just gone over the kind of molecular structure of what's called a serine protease. It's something that is used in almost all kinds of cells that break down proteins. It's even in your own body right now, breaking down the proteins that you've eaten. And we were looking at how it works at the atomic level. And I was just so blown away by the elegance and beauty of how it works. And I was just like, I was in a lecture hall like you guys are right now, and I was just silently worshiping God. And I felt like that was one of those moments in which, like, okay, God, I don't know how you brought this system into being. I don't know the details of that, but it is something that you're worthy of worship for. Right? And that's where like the integration started really deepening, right? And then I went on, and it's a long story of how I ended up in theology instead of in science. But when I went to seminary, I was able to study Hebrew and study biblical interpretation, as well as different theological views on this kind of thing. So that really helped in terms of fleshing it out some more. And then one reason why I went into philosophy, right? And the specialty of epistemology that I focus on, like, how do we know? How can we know? These kind of things. I think I was really drawn to that because that is kind of like the foundation between like theological questions and scientific questions, because in both of these spheres, we're asking questions of what do we know and how do we know these things, right? And then this kind of underlying question of how can we kind of bring these things together to kind of have a unified whole in terms of how we look at the world. Right? So those are it's like a brief snapshot in terms of like this trajectory, and it's something that I continue to think about and write about, actually.
It's fascinating that those are not separate questions, right? Like that science and theology and even philosophy, we want to make a distinction between those. They're all asking this fundamental question about how do we know what we know?
Right.
What's really real? What is truth? And how do we know if something is true or not, right? So there's this actually shared common thing. And maybe there's different ways of going about it, and different views and paradigms for getting there, but there's still this fundamental, almost curiosity about the world that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of a feature of modern life just in the last couple hundred years, in which it's like, before the last couple hundred years, you could truly be a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman in which you understood all of these different disciplines that kind of addressed a particular question, like this big question of how do we get here, right?
Yeah.
And so you can actually survey the whole thing, like Isaac Newton could actually do that. But within the last couple hundred years, we've really fragmented, right? In terms of like, okay, you guys focus on theology over there and biblical studies over there, but you focus just on the science there. And I feel like in some ways we don't really talk to each other enough, right? And have a kind of integrative discussion in terms of looking at all the evidence and looking at all the different kind of facts that pertain to the matter. And so I think that that's one of my goals in terms of, as a scholar and as a teacher, to try to bring these kind of threads together, right? To try to have a more cohesive and integrated account of reality.
So then, if it sounds like it's not science or faith, as if these two things that are separated, but that you're seeing some sort of integration that can be brought together. So talk a little bit more about that. Like, where do you see the commonalities, and then where are some of those distinctions that, well, actually science is over here doing its own thing, and faith is answering different kinds of questions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's actually interesting, because if you examine what science does and examine what theology does, there's actually quite striking structural parallels, right? Because in both cases, you're kind of interpreting facts, right? So like, think about science, right? You're looking at the world, you're seeing facts, you're taking observations, you're doing experiments, and then you're doing an interpretation of that, saying, okay, what do those facts kind of mean in terms of how do we think about the world? So you come up with hypotheses and theories, right? So, we can't literally see atoms, right? But we believe that atoms are there because that's our best interpretation of the facts that we observe, through our instruments and things like that. But in a very similar way, in theology, we take certain facts, but in this case, a different set of facts that we see in Scripture, facts that we see in reasoning and things like that, and then come up with theories or interpretations of that, and we have kind of rival interpretations of that, and then we kind of try to figure out what's the best interpretation of the facts that we see in Scripture, or the facts that we see in reason, and all these other areas, and tradition, and various other things, right? So I think that there are definitely structural similarities. I think the difference, though, is that the data that you're working with obviously is very different, right? Science is focused on what we can observe with our senses, and then the way that our senses are augmented by instruments like telescopes and microscopes and more advanced things than that. But then in theology, we're talking about things that we can see in human conscience, the things that we see in Scripture, the things that we see in the tradition of the church throughout the generations. So I think that it's kind of like what facts that we're looking at will be different. But I think when we're talking about this kind of integration, then we kind of zoom out in terms of like, oh, we have these different interpretations from Genesis and these different interpretations from what we see out in nature. We zoom out and try to incorporate all the facts, right? And have a broader kind of view of a larger interpretation or larger theory. And I think that's where you can have this kind of connection, and synergy between that. Right? But I think it is true that on both sides, on the theological side as well as on the scientific side, you have different interpretations of reality. So even here's just one example. Even within the secular world of origin sciences, there are different camps in terms of how we think about evolution. Right? So there are different versions of evolution, and even some thinkers who are not Christians, who are not theists, but who reject kind of like the mainstream paradigm and come up with a different kind of interpretation of the facts. And similarly with Genesis, there's going to be different interpretations of that. And the question in both cases is, what's a better interpretation of these kind of facts and evidence, right? And so that's where the debate goes, right? Both in the scientific side as well as the theological side.
So let's go there. Let's talk about Genesis 1, Genesis 2. This is something that the students have read this week, right? Exploring this creation narrative or creation narratives. What are possible ways for faithful Christians to read the Bible and have that in relation to understandings of modern science, and specifically about evolution, right? That seems to be the one that comes up. Like, how can I reconcile some idea of evolution with what I've read in this particular text? Are there different ways of doing this, or how do we understand that?
So broadly speaking, there are three different camps, right? among Christians in terms of how we think about Genesis and origins with regard to the science. The reason why there are three different camps is because there's actually two kind of distinct questions that will be raised. The first question is the Earth and the universe old or is it young? Right? So I said when I was growing up, I was kind of raised in this kind of young Earth creationist background and thinking that the Earth and the universe is only about 6,000 years old, whereas a different answer to that question is the Earth is actually really old, like billions of years old. We're in this universe that's like 13 billion years old. So those are radically different answers to that question. But then there's this other question that is kind of distinct from that. It's related but distinct, is how did the different species, including us, come into being? Right? And there's this kind of this question of, it came out through this process of Darwinian evolution, and then other people would say, no, it didn't come through a process of Darwinian evolution, that God specially created species along the way. And so based on how you answer that, you're going to end up in these three different camps, right? So the first camp would be young Earth creationism. I already talked about that you read Genesis 1 as like 6 24-hour days, right? And that God specially created these species, and evolution really didn't have any role. Then you have this other camp called old Earth creationism that says, no, the universe is actually much older. It's like billions of years old, but evolution is not capable of bringing about all these species, so that at certain points in geological history, God specially created like the first cell and the first multicellular organism, and then much later, God created the first human beings, right? So that's old Earth creationism. And then there's this third camp called theistic evolution. Sometimes it's called evolutionary creationism, that God uses evolution as his kind of instrument for bringing about the world. And that camp agrees with old Earth creationism in saying that the universe is really old, billions of years old, but it says actually evolution is capable of bringing about the diversity of species and the human race without God kind of specially intervening at different points. And the thing is, these three different camps, young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, and theistic evolution, they have followers in terms of Christians all over the world. Here at Fox, I know professors who fall into each of these different categories, right? And so it's not something, Fox doesn't require professors to sign on to a particular stance on this. But that's basically the landscape in terms of how we think about it. And it really is rooted in these two questions. How old is the Earth? And is evolution capable of bringing about the species that we see?
So let me ask maybe more of a textual question too. It sounds like young Earth creationism reads the days in Genesis 1 in particular as 6 literal 24-hour days, that kind of a cycle. But it seems like you would have to read it differently to get to old Earth creationism and theistic evolution.
Right.
So talk about that. What are the differences there?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question because if you actually look at the history of how Christians, and Jews actually, because obviously Genesis, it comes from the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. So both Jews and Christians, for over 1,000 years before Darwin ever showed up on the scene, they were debating this question, this very question of how do we understand the days in Genesis 1? So they were not being driven by questions of whether evolution is true or not. They were just looking at the text and they were very confused, right? So it's very interesting. The early church father, St. Augustine, who lived in the 4th and 5th century, he actually wrote on the days of Genesis quite a bit. And at some point in The City of God, which is like his magnum opus, he actually says, I don't have any idea of what these days mean. It's so confusing, and it's impossible to even imagine what these days are, right? And the reason why is this, when you actually do a close reading of Genesis 1, it's actually not as straightforward as you might think. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned, the 6 days, the literal meaning of the 24 hours. But actually, if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, I can count at least 4 different literal meanings of the Hebrew word yom, right, in those 2 chapters. So, for example, on the first day, if you remember when you read Genesis, on the first day it says God created light, and he separated that from darkness. And then notice what he says, and he called that light day, mm-hmm. right? So that day, which is the Hebrew word yom, it can't mean 24 hours. It means around 12 hours. I mean, depending on where you are in terms of the latitude and the seasons and whatever, but about 12 hours of the day. So that yom means 12 hours. But at the very end of that very same verse, it says, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. And that's yom. And so in that very same verse, the word yom literally means different things. They can't mean the same thing. Right? So there's two counts there. At the end of the 6 days of creation, and after the seventh day, in Genesis, I think 2:4, it says, in the day that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. Mm-hmm. And that word again there is the Hebrew word yom. And there, that can't mean 12 hours, it can't mean 24 hours. It has to be more. It has to be at least 144 hours, right? Because that's 6 times 24. It has to be at least that, maybe more. So there, literally, that can't mean 24 hours. And then even more interestingly, later on in chapter 2, when God warns Adam about eating from the fruit of a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, if you eat of it, in that day you will surely die.
Right.
And again, that's yom. And so here's a fourth meaning of yom, because it can't mean literally 24 hours there, because he doesn't die in 24 hours, right? Later on in Genesis, it says that he lived to 930 years. So early Christian scholars looked at that and said, so that means yom could mean 24 hours, but it could also mean maybe 1,000 years. Because there's other passages in the Bible that says, to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So it's very interesting, like this history of disagreement in terms of interpretation of Genesis 1 and the days of Genesis 1. It's something that long predated Darwin. And because there's been this disagreement among Christians and Jews for all these centuries and even millennia about that, it's actually not clear, just from reading the text by itself, what these yom, in that second sense, literally means. Because literally speaking, yom can mean all these different things, at least 4 different things in the biblical text.
See, what's fascinating about that, too, is like we can just read that and skim over it and just take our own kind of modern interpretations and go, well, yeah, I know what day means.
Yeah.
But it takes that close reading and paying attention, and even the idea that, so how we seem to measure days has to do with the rotation of the earth around the sun, right? And the spinning of the earth and those types of things. But the earth and the sun aren't made until, or the sun isn't made until the 4th day in Genesis 1. So how is that even measured if it's not measured the same way that we would normally measure in our kind of modern scientific age? So these are the kinds of questions, and it's fascinating is they aren't scientific questions in the sense that it's pre-modern science. Folks are asking the question about the text.
Yeah, they're textual questions, right? I mean, I'm glad you brought up the 4th day, because that's something that Augustine points out. He's like, wait a minute, how can these be regular days? Because if the sun by which we measure evening and morning, if the sun didn't exist until the 4th day, like what's going on in the first 3 days, right? So that's one of the reasons why he kind of throws his hands up and says, I don't know, right? And Augustine is one of the most intelligent and well-read early church fathers. So I mean, he's not an idiot, right?
Right.
So that's one thing he points out. Another thing that Augustine, for example, points out is that there's in Hebrew poetry is not based on like sounds, right? In English poetry as well as Greek and Roman poetry, it's all about kind of the rhythm of accents and, those of you who study literature. But Hebrew poetry is not like that. Hebrew poetry is more about kind of parallelism, right? And you see that in the Psalms, right? Like these kind of repeated things spoken in different ways. And Genesis 1 is very interesting because you have that parallelism. It says, and God said, and God said, and God said. There's evening and morning, the X day, right? The nth day, that kind of thing, right? But what's interesting that Augustine also notices is, again, close textual reading. He notices that the 7th day does not have the pattern of evening and morning the 7th day. Mm-hmm. It doesn't show up. And so he's like, that might mean that the 7th day continues to this very day, right? That might be the implication. And actually, I don't have time to go into this, but there's actually some evidence from the New Testament that seems to align with that idea. And so Augustine's like saying, well, if the 7th day actually never ended, and that means that maybe those other 6 days are not 24-hour periods.
Like we're still living in this 7th day or age or time or frame of God's presence and declaring things are good. And
exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's so fascinating that these kind of small textual details that are really significant cause these kind of disagreements in terms of interpretation, even among the best kind of biblical scholars throughout the generations. And even today, like if you go talk to different folks with PhDs in Hebrew Bible or Old Testament interpretation, they're going to have very different views on what the Genesis 1 days mean.
So what are some helpful ways to think about this then? Like give us some practical ideas of how should we think about or approach things like Genesis 1 and 2? And maybe what are some pitfalls? Like, what should we not do that might lead us astray?
I think that if we're cognizant of this kind of historical record of these kind of different interpretations, it should lead us to a certain kind of intellectual humility, right? So I wouldn't dare to think that I'm as bright and well-read as St. Augustine was, right? Even though, I know a lot more about science than he did, but the idea is all these brilliant minds throughout the history of the church, as well as even in our present day, have deep disagreements about this. That means that a good number of them are wrong. Right? I mean, think about that, right? Because fundamentally, whether you're young Earth, old Earth creationists, or theistic evolutionists, at least two of those camps is wrong. It could be that all three camps are wrong, but at least two of them are wrong. So that means I might find myself in one of those camps that is wrong, right? And so one of the problems I see in the current day contemporary church is that we kind of demonize people who disagree with us on this question. I mean, not everyone does, but many people do. Young Earth creationists say to old Earth creationists, or theistic evolutionists, you're just compromising, you just want to be accepted by secular people, blah, blah. And then they return the compliment and say, well, you young Earthers, you don't know anything about science, you're just totally ignorant. That's not a charitable and loving way to treat our fellow Christians. I think that we have to have a certain kind of intellectual humility and say, look, this is something that Christians have disagreed with for millennia. And we may have reasons for favoring one view versus another, but I think that this is where it's kind of like we continue to learn. This is something that I've been doing for decades, learning and studying. And even though I've grown in terms of my confidence, in terms of my own view, I think I'm still open to the fact that maybe I'm just seeing it wrong. Maybe I'm weighing things slightly differently. And I think that that's kind of like that level of humility to say, okay, we disagree on this, but it's not something that threatens like the core of our faith. It's something that we can disagree with each other charitably and humbly, and ask God to further give us illumination, further give us understanding.
So tell me a bit about then how does one hold on to one's faith, even with the idea that, well, I might be wrong about this particular thing. Because that can lead to a lot of fear, or a lot of sense of like, well, if I'm mistaken about Genesis 1 and 2, do I just toss out the whole Bible? Does any of this matter? Is it all just opinions or those types of things? Like, how does one hold on to the truth or knowledge? Talking about epistemology, right, and these types of questions, like, how do you hold on to something in the midst of all these different seemingly conflicting opinions?
Yeah, so I think this is where it's like, in both science as well as in theology, something that it took me a long time to realize, like until I got to grad school actually, that not everything is as important as other things, and not everything is as clear as other things, right? So here's just one example in the scientific realm. Like, it used to be that scientists believed that the universe was eternally old, that there was no beginning to the universe, right? But nowadays, because of all the evidence that we see, like, that's something that has really been overturned. Like, scientists do believe that the universe began at a certain point, right? And so this idea, that's a lot more certain than exactly how the universe came to be, or exactly how species came to be, right? And I think similarly in Scripture and in theology, there are certain things that are more unclear and certain things that are more clear, right? And we have to acknowledge that. And the thing is, I think that like there's this idea that the things that are clearer are the things that are actually more important, right? So like, here's just another theological debate that just opens up a can of worms. Like this question of like predestination and free will, that's another thing I'd love to think about and talk about. But that question is unclear in Scripture, I would argue, right? And it's something that Christians have debated, but I think if it were really important, right, for our faith, for our life, then it's something that God would make absolutely clear. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's a trust that like the things that really are important are the things that are clear, that we can have stronger confidence in. And so with regard to Genesis 1, it's like, okay, exactly how God created these things or how long that took and things like that, that's maybe a little clear, ambiguous in certain ways. But the things that are clear in Genesis 1 is that there is a God. That there is a single God, that He's not rivaled by any other God, that He created us in wisdom and love, and He cares for creation, and creation is very good. Those are the things that are just unambiguous. Those are things that are absolutely clear. And I think coming back to that question of being afraid. I think this is something that many Christians, they're afraid of science. They're worried that if they learn more about science, they're going to have to kind of drop their whole faith. But I think the fact that there are these three camps between young Earth, old Earth, as well as theistic evolutionists. And each of them, I know personally people who have PhDs in each of those camps, right? The fact that there are these other camps should be a comfort to you, right? Because even if you grew up, let's say, as I did as a young Earth creationist, and you end up being an old Earth creationist, or you end up being a theistic evolutionist, it doesn't mean that you've left the faith. It means that you've joined just this other community of Christians who hold to theistic evolution, or who hold to old Earth creationists. And so I think that should give your mind a little bit of ease, right? In the sense that, like, you're not the only one who's wrestled with these questions, and there are communities of faithful followers of Jesus who hold on to each and every one of those views that I laid out.
Well, even in here, like our course in Theo 101, one of the main things we talk about is a virtue of faith, this idea of trusting in divine promises and obedience to divine commands. And it is a faithful step to look at the text, to come to some sort of conclusion about it, and then to not do it with blindness or a lack of intellect. Like, incredibly intelligent people are wrestling with these same things, and then saying, I might be wrong, and yet I can still move forward and hold a particular position, make a statement or have a conviction about these particular things, and still be faithful to God, and faithful even to the vocation of whether that's theology, philosophy, science, or whatever, that God is active and at work in those particular ways. I want to turn now to have you guys talk. Right here in the front, start us off.
Hey, so a big question that I had after hearing you talk, the way that you describe theistic evolution kind of sounds like God set the earth in motion and then evolution kind of took care of the rest. But to me, the beauty of Genesis 1 is God's direct involvement in our creation and Him making everything. So do you believe that theistic evolution somewhat undermines God's power and capabilities?
Okay, so let me be a devil's advocate, because I'm not a theistic evolutionist. If I were to choose one of those camps, I would say I'm an old Earth creationist, but one that allows a certain amount of evolution, but not everything. So this is, incidentally, I'm not Catholic, but this is actually the official position of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church says evolution has happened, but the 2 points in which they'll insist that God actually specially did things was at the first life, the first cell, and then at human beings, right? And so I think I would have something like that. I think probably God did other things in the meantime as well, but just like microevolution, we're seeing it happen right now. Look at COVID, right? Like the Omicron variant. You can actually look at the mutations that it's had since 2020, right? And you can actually see evolution happening, and it's much better at infecting us than these earlier variants, right? So I think a certain degree of evolution has happened, but I think personally myself, because of many reasons, I have like a whole hour lecture I could talk about this, but for chemistry reasons at the first cell, as well as like philosophical reasons about consciousness and free will and the soul for the first human, I think that I agree in the sense that God is necessary to kind of do something special at those points. But let me play the devil's advocate, because I have friends of mine who are theistic evolutionists, who are PhDs and things like that, and they would say actually they would say that in a different way, if God could create a system that would auto-generate these kind of living things, it actually is even more kind of reflecting the power of God, the wisdom of God, right? It's kind of like, instead of creating a game, let's say, I'm going to create an algorithm that creates the game for me, right? In some ways, that's actually even more clever and wiser, right? Here's another example. Think about the iPhone, right? The iPhone is a very complex piece of machinery and things like that. And so in some sense, that's like, it takes great deal of intelligence and wisdom to create the iPhone. But in a different way, what Apple does is it actually creates the entire infrastructure, the machinery, the engineers, the supply chain to produce all those parts to bring it about, right? So in some sense, making the machinery that makes the iPhone is even more complex and more sophisticated than the phone itself, which is kind of amazing, right? So the theistic evolutionists would come back at you and say, well, yes, if God specially created Adam and Eve or specially created the cell, that's wonderful and great and awesome and powerful. But if God could create a system that creates those things for him, that's even more powerful. Do you see, it's a different kind of power and wisdom. Again, I'm not a theistic evolutionist. I'm just saying you can see where these different camps might disagree, and they're appealing to different aspects of God's power and wisdom. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
Great question. Who's next?
My question is we've discussed the different variations of how we interpret the word day in the book of Genesis. My question is does that form of time affect characters in the book of Genesis? So we see characters like Adam living to 930 years old, and then we see Noah living 950 years old. Could that also be how we interpret day and night, and possibly if the earth was possibly closer to the sun and time was going faster, and that's why these characters are going at like an expensive amount of years compared to like us living at like 100?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. Like, and in fact, if you actually graph, I've done this. If you actually graph the ages of these genealogies, in Genesis, you actually see that it fits an exponential decay curve. So you start out with all these people who are living with 900 years, and they slowly have lower and lower lifespans until you get to like Abraham's day. So it's kind of an interesting kind of mathematical relationship there. But I think that there's something else going on there with regard to genealogies. And people have proposed like, well, maybe the days were different, maybe the years were different, that kind of thing back then. But I think what's interesting is there are other ancient Near Eastern documents that also have very similar kind of things. So I'm thinking about there's this one Sumerian king list. Sumer was this ancient kingdom in around Babylon or modern day Iraq, right? And they had these lists of the kings. And what's interesting is they also talk about a worldwide flood. And what's interesting is the reigns of the kings in their list before the flood are much, much longer. I think they're like in the thousands of years or tens of thousands of years than the reigns of their kings after the flood. So I think there is something going on there in terms of like these ancient Near Eastern genealogies or lists of kings. Like either maybe something's going on with regard to the world in terms of like the days being different or something like that, or the years being different. Although I kind of doubt that, because if we were closer to the sun or something like that, we'd all burn up, right? I mean, if you think global warming's bad now, I mean, if we were much closer to the sun, we'd really be toast. But I think there's this other aspect, and if you're interested, you can email me, I can email you this paper. There's this paper that this one woman scholar wrote that actually showed that all those years in the genealogies are actually, you can decompose them into factors of 60. And what's fascinating about that is 60 was the base of the Babylonian mathematical system. We have like base 10, you count on 10 fingers, and there's binary, which is base 2, but the Babylonians have base 60. And that's actually where we get 60 minutes in an hour, 60 degrees, in a second. Or anyway, the angles and things like that. And so she actually ran the numbers and said that each of those numbers, like 930, could be decomposed into factors of 60. And the probability that could happen in a random kind of way would be like astronomical. So in this paper, it was they were convinced that there's some kind of numerological significance to these years that were put in the genealogy list. So I think that we're in a very different culture in terms of understanding what the text says. But I think that the ages in these genealogies, I think there's some kind of hidden significance there that we don't fully grasp because we're not living in that culture where we're using base 60, right? I mean, that's just kind of weird, right? So I don't know if that gives you any further light on that, but those are some considerations I have about these dates and ages.
I'll pick up on that in just like what you were saying, Dr. Choi, about when we're reading the Bible, we have to recognize that it is an ancient text from a totally different culture. And we talked a little bit about this, like it's like traveling to a new country and another time and another place. And so the way that the text is constructed and how it's speaking to its original audience is also going to be something that's remarkably different. So if we take 21st century American westernized scientific frameworks and place that on the text and read it through that lens solely, it might distort what's actually being said there. We might miss something significant about the text because we've been looking at it through our particular lens and our particular culture and time frame. We have time for some more questions, so let's keep going.
So I'm sorry to say this, but like, where is your faith? You said a lot of scientific things, but I'm just having trouble because like the scripture, you said a couple things of scripture, but there's a lot of people nowadays that have been basing and the church has been falling away from the trueness And so, yes, you were going back to Genesis, but Jesus reestablished the church, and ultimately Jesus is the new way and the life. And so, kind of scientifically, if you think about it, like when Peter, he went to walk on water, he didn't spread out his toes to get more surface area. He had, like, the reason why he fell through the waters was because he doubted in his faith with God. And so I think ultimately it's like the 6 days, yes, that is kind of cool. But it's like, hey, Father, I don't understand, but I trust you. And so science kind of falls within that. Science does become, it relates to religion, and so it backs up faith. But I don't think we should put God in a box of science. We should think science in a mindset of our own faith and not put faith in the mindset of science.
Yeah, so I think that that's not a problem that I have. I have no problems believing in miracles. That's not the reason why I'm an old earth creationist, right? Because like I believe Jesus rose from the dead. I believe all these things. I've actually even seen in my own life miraculous answers to prayer. Like I know a friend of mine who was a pastor's wife. She had a brain tumor in the middle of her head, and she had 4 young kids, and she had no idea what to do. And the doctors were saying this is inoperable. We don't know what to do. But so she sent out this email to all her friends and family in her church around the country, and we were just fervently praying for her. And amazingly, at the next scan, all that was left was a hole where that tumor was. It disappeared. The doctors had no idea how that happened, right? It was just full of fluid. And of course, her and her husband, we were like, we know what happened. God answered prayer. So don't get me wrong. I'm not someone who rejects the possibility of miracles. I think there's nothing you can there's no way through science that you can show that miracles can't happen, right? That's not the reason why I interpret Genesis the way I do. The reason why is because I think there's the scientific evidence that we see for an old earth that's extremely difficult to explain, have a coherent interpretation of them. Here's just one example, starlight, right? Even young earth creationists admit that there are stars and galaxies that are millions, if not billions, of light years away from us, right? I think Andromeda galaxy is like 25 million light years, right? And so the light that we're seeing, because light has a finite, speed, the light that we're seeing from Andromeda left Andromeda 25 million years ago. And young earth creationists, they actually don't dispute that it's actually that far. They agree with that distance. And so the question is, if that's true, how could that light have gotten to us? Because if the universe is only 6,000 years old, there hasn't been enough time for the light to get to us. And that is a huge problem, actually, for young earth creationism. Now, there may be some way to get around it. I've yet to see an interpretation of those particular facts with regard to starlight that actually makes sense with both the science and with Genesis. So that's one of the reasons why I go that way. Not because I don't think that God is all-powerful, not because I don't think miracles happen, because I've seen them happen, but it's because what's the best interpretation of both the scientific facts as well as the scriptural facts that coheres and is integrated. Mm-hmm. Did you want to say something?
Good.
Looks like you're good.
Well, I did. The one thing I have heard about the young earth creationists and why that might be is that God created it that way, and kind of created these stars to seem like they were 25 million years old.
Oh yeah, so that's I think. So one of my friends from PhD. He has a PhD in philosophy as well. He said, and he's a young earth creationist. He actually admitted to me when we were in grad school that this apparent age thing is the only thing. So like, the only way to really solve this problem. He said, when Adam and Eve were created, did they have belly buttons? Right? Because if they have belly buttons, it would seem that they were born from a woman, but in fact they weren't, right? So like, what's wrong with God creating starlight in transit, right? So even though we haven't had 25 million years for that light to get here, why couldn't God do that? And God certainly could do that, but I think the theological question is, why would He do that, especially for stars and galaxies that are not even visible to our naked eye? What function would that serve? Wouldn't it actually make more sense for Him to create light in transit from stars that are actually visible and are closer? So I think that question, because it seems that, here's an example, stars that go supernova that are over 100,000 light years from us. So that means that star has never actually existed, right? Because the light of the supernova was created in transit, but there was never a star there that blew up. For a lot of old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists, that seems to be almost kind of deceptive on the part of God. Why would God create light that looks like supernovae that never actually happened because they're so far away? Does that? I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes any
it's raising
sense.
some good questions here.
Yeah.
Please, please, please give a round of applause for Dr. Isaac Choi.
Thank you.
This video podcast is a production of George Fox Digital. To find more material like this, you can subscribe to George Fox Talks on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Our team really appreciates your feedback in the form of likes, comments, and reviews, and we'd really love to hear what you think. To sign up for our weekly email list and to keep up to date with the latest episodes and publications, you can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.